not, but you can go in and aside from the code that you're putting in, you know, very specific, customized, proprietary code for a certain function that you want to run. You can also configure these. You can version them. You can size up, scale in, scale out the memory and compute resources. Just a number of things. Again, I don't have time for death by PowerPoint, nor do I think you'd want it anyway. But probably the biggest takeaway from this in a security standpoint is that it's sandboxed. So the container itself and the code that's executing is running as a non-privileged local user. And atop of that, there's identity and access management access restrictions placed on that. So, and we'll get into that here in the next few slides. Again, other services, it's got multiple concurrency, dynamic capacity allocation. There's some really cool analytics and debugging you can do in case, you know, you want to really make sure you're squeezing as much out of this code as you can. This could be a very high velocity environment that's serving up web pages, anything from web pages to pulling down content out of an S3 bucket. There's all sorts of use cases. So again, real high level here. Hope you can see it, because I know it's kind of bleaching it out a little bit with the lights, but on the left side are going to be your event sources. So at the top there you have DynamoDB. It's a NoSQL database native to AWS. Simple notification service, again another AWS service. API gateway. CFT is a cloud formation template. Allows you to, it's the infrastructure as code that's now being called, so you're actually pushing out code templates and it brings up an entire virtualized environment in a matter of seconds. And then the almighty S3 that, if you haven't heard about S3 yet, you should learn more about S3. So we can have a number of events from any of those sources, and by the way, those 5 right there are just kind of a tip of the iceberg. There's, again, a whole ecosystem of AWS services that could trigger a Lambda event. So from the outside looking in, you're thinking it's Lambda, it's code. You know, what's really underneath it, though, is based off some of the research that I've done hands-on and reading around, is this actually resides in Amazon's ECS, which is an elastic container service. It allows you to scale out, scale in EC2 instance clusters, and within those also scale in, scale out microservices based off of containerization. So within each of those clusters you have Docker instances, or in this case we'll find out is Amazon Linux images that are running as containers, and then you have the Lambda function that's actually being called and executed within that container. And I know it's probably hard to see again with the lights, but 4 languages currently supported is Python, Node.js, C#, and Java. Java is the one that's kind of hidden there down the bottom right. So real simple, almost hello world example. We're going to feed in a JSON formatted input of key 1, 2, and 3, value 1, 2, and 3 into our, again, very simplistic function over here, print loading function, and we're going to define a Lambda handler. And that's going to be the main function within your Lambda function. It's handling an event. Passes 2 arguments, event and context, and we're just going to print those values out. Print event key 1, event key 1 value, so on and so forth. And then we're going to return a value, because we may want to do that, and that might trigger another event that does something else. So see the top here, code on the right, this is the output. Loading function, it's printing out the values, and then it's going to return a value. So the next thing we need to focus on in the context of security, because pretty much everything within AWS rests on their identity and access management services. Really great idea. You can get very granular with the controls, but as you'll see here in a moment, there's a downside to that as well. So concepts. So much like most identity and access management solutions, you have the concept of a user. AWS puts in a little bit of different context, that it could be a person or a service, right? So you have service accounts, whatnot. It's authenticated with a name or an identity, password, or you can use access keys as well. You can make programmatic access, meaning it would maybe make API calls, but it can't log into the AWS web console to do other management tasks. Important thing to note is it's created with no permissions by default, meaning if I create a user and I let's say, hey, go log in, you can't even change your password. I mean, it's that tight. It can be very, very tight. Similarly, group, just like any other group you probably dealt with, it's a collection of users with similar permissions. It's basically boils down to administrative convenience for granting and revoking access. You want someone to have the access, the same other administrators or backup guys or whatever it might be, you add them to that group. When they don't need it anymore, you pull them out of the group. Role. So this one's a little different context in AWS than traditional roles. So in AWS, you can assign temporary permissions using roles. It's really good if you're running an EC2 instance in AWS, which is just a virtual machine if you're not familiar with that. And you want it to access certain things, but you don't want to have to give it a username and password. You just want all the applications that are on that instance to be able to do whatever it needs. You can create a role, give it the permissions, and assign that role to that instance or cluster of instances, right? You can have a group of roles, I guess, in essence. When you do that, and it's authenticating, it's using Amazon's Simple Token Service, otherwise known as STS, and it's retrieving credentials from the EC2 metadata. It's a local interface that it can pull credential information from. We'll get to that also a little later. So what does this all boil down to? How do you enforce this? How do you, say what you can and can't do? Well, it's through a policy. It's a JSON formatted document that defines permissions. It is managed or inline, so that in AWS terms means they give you a template. You can say, I want to work with this one. You can go in and create your own policies, or you can attach them kind of what they call inline. So it's if you maybe have one-off permission. You have the whole group, but this one user maybe has a one-off permission. You can do an inline and say, I want just this user to have these permissions. So what is a IAM policy comprised of? Version, ID, kind of, I don't know, not really that important, but the statement is where the meat of the policy is. You have the security identifier, you have an effect, you have a principle, an action, a resource, a condition, and you have kind of subs each one of those. And it can get really complex. Again, AWS gives you the ability to really, really lock down your environment, which, kudos to them for doing that. The problem is you start looking at the policies and it becomes this big mess, especially when you want to lock it down. Yeah, you can lock yourself out very easily, right? So where are we at on time? Just about 20 in, good. And slow down a little bit then, that's good. So we'll talk a little bit about attack vectors, right? Now, I threw this in here because this is important, right? Disclaimer that all the attack vectors I'm about to show you assume that whatever permissions have been either granted or revoked or whatever through a role or policies or user or what have you. Because of the complexity and esoteric nature of the IAM policies, typically people will go in and give it a wildcard, all resources for this user. It's a lot easier, right? I don't have to go in and troubleshoot it. I don't have to go in and say, list buckets, get bucket, put bucket, or object, so on and so forth for S3. It can be a real hassle. It really can. But at the same time, if you know it well enough, and it is its own science, if you know it well enough, you can really lock down an environment. Problem is, you have serverless web service frameworks, automation tools, subscription-based third-party solutions from Amazon Marketplace. If you're not familiar with that, it's where you can go buy Amazon machine images from a third party, run it on your own environment. And a lot of those require, and I'm not going to name any, but A lot of those require pretty lax permissions. And then, you know, not to blame admins, but we tend to have, myself included in the past, lazy admins. You just want to kind of get something done. You know, your boss or whoever is screaming on your neck, and we need to get this done. You know, it's an incident response. I need to make a quick change so we can troubleshoot this, and then you forget about it. So again, this, just wanted to point this out. This, everything I'm about to show you comes with this caveat, but it's a very realistic risk. Happens all the time. Probably, now that I think about it, probably one of the more well-known one would be the open S3 buckets that are on the internet all the time, right? It's either going to be an S3 bucket policy, object ACL, or some sort of IAM policy that's not enforcing any sort of restriction on access. So, as with any sort of research, we start off with reconnaissance. Curious minds want to know, what sort of operating system is running under this Lambda thing? Again, you know, I had a friend tell me that there's a container running beneath it. I'm like, that's really interesting. How can we start poking and prodding at that? So what kind of OS is running? What's the network look like? How many interfaces are there? What's the net masks? What's the default routes? Who can access the file system? Is it read only? Is it read write? Is it read write in one place and read only in the next? What sort of processes are running? Again, containers are typically 1, 2, maybe 3 processes. It could be an Apache container and it's just running Apache. You could have a full LAMP stack. It could be, you know, Apache, MySQL, PHP all running. But the point is, it's just a few processes. So which ones are running with Lambda? Where are the credentials stored? So we talked a moment ago about EC2 instance metadata and how it authenticates using IAM roles. Well, I had suspected that Lambda probably did something similar to that. So where are these credentials stored? How are we, you know, how is this Lambda function accessing the resources that I'm, you know, authoring code to allow it to do? And then most importantly, how's the function that I'm writing bootstrapped and executed? Because if we can gain control of that process, we could probably do some really interesting things, right? Once you start controlling the flow of data and information and execution of it, whatever it's able to access, you may be able to access, and then some. So here's what we already know. This, again, screenshotted right off of AWS's website. Question, does AWS Lambda support environment variables? Yes, you can easily create and modify environment variables from the AWS Lambda console, CLI, or SDK. To learn more about them, click here. What restrictions apply to AWS Lambda function code? Lambda attempts to impose as few restrictions as possible. Found that very interesting. Now, they did do some due diligence here. At the end there, they say, you know, ports like TCP 25, SMTP traffic's blocked for, you know, anti-spam measure and whatnot. So, you know, they're not being careless. They put in some due diligence here. But nonetheless, I'm thinking, wow, you know, they're saying that it has environment variables and placing as few restrictions as possible on it. That sounds like might have some good possibilities for attack vectors. So where do we start? Started tinkering around with the idea of, well, how do I access that underlying container? And I had recently done some coding, actually for the CTF we're running today. I had been wanting to teach myself Python for a while. I was doing some coding for the CTF to pull down Docker images, which coincidentally, this is running a container as well. And I was like, you know, the interface for pulling down Docker images from AWS's container registry, the SDK's API is not real friendly, so generally just do, you know, OS system calls, which basically, whatever you put in double quotes passes to the underlying OS and it executes it. And that's how I was pulling down Docker images. So I thought to myself, why couldn't I just start doing the same and just poking around the file system on the Lambda container itself? So it's exactly what I did. I did ls, I did, you know, cat etc password, and start poking around and like start to find some really cool stuff. It worked originally. Suddenly it stopped working. I don't know why that is. I don't know if they put restrictions on it because of me or if it's just my account that they did that on. Whatever the case, I can't get it to work anymore. So I'm like, oh man, dead end. Well, now this is going to be really difficult to see, but I'm going to try to kind of, so the code here, instead of doing os.systemls or whatever, instead of that, I've typed in here in the upper, good? Am I too close to something? Oh. Oh, okay, gotcha. So the code, instead of doing a system calls, I'm just doing os.environ, which returns all the environment variables that the container has stored in it. You can come on in. You can come in? Oh, cool. So the box in the red that I've highlighted here, what it's pointing at, probably difficult to see, there's a variable called AWS session token. And that is something that AWS IAM uses, again, for that role-based authentication for services. So I'm like, oh, I'm onto something here, right? So and instead of kind of scrolling through it, just figure I'll go ahead and dump the contents of that. And so here I'm dumping AWS security token, AWS session token, AWS secret access key, and AWS secret key ID. I'm like, okay, this is cool. What can I do with this now? Because again, you can run AWS commands through AWS command line interface. You can do it through their API calls, or you can do it through an SDK, like Python has Boto 3. That's what we've actually been using for this. So what can I do with that? What if I took those credentials, copied them, and then I pasted them into my AWS CLI configuration file? They've got a credential file for your command line interface. What if I did that? What would happen? So I did that. And again, just for proof of concept purposes, I gave my Lambda function excessive access. And sure enough, I was able to access everything the Lambda function was able to. Now, like I pointed out earlier, the Lambda function's got a limitation of, it can only run for 300 seconds, right? This avoids that limitation. Now I can access that, but there's one other hitch. Those session and security tokens, they're only valid for an hour by default. So now I have to constantly refresh that. So we'll get to that in a minute. But the point here was I was able to access those resources. More importantly, I'm accessing those resources as the Lambda function. So in the AWS CloudTrail and CloudWatch logs, guess who shows up? Not me, Lambda, right? So now I'm impersonating, whatever you want to call it, credential hijacking. I'm getting unauthorized access. I'm able to maybe do some additional reconnaissance. Because again, I'm not under a 300-second limit. I've actually extended that now to an hour because the limitation is on the credentials. And as we'll see here in a minute, could do some persistent remote access. So we have the residual insider threat. So I'm a cloud admin, and one day someone says, you know what, you're being riffed. We got to do a headcount reduction, and I'm like, man, what am I going to do? I'm really angry about it. Whatever. So I go in there, create my Lambda function. It's going to spit these credentials out, and then I still have remote access to the environment, because who goes through and, one, reviews Lambda code on a regular basis, and two, who goes through and deprovisions those Lambda functions that those people have written? In my experience, I haven't come across that yet. So you've got a decoupling of user termination, which in all likelihood they're AD credentials and VPN access and all that stuff's deprovisioned, but has been completely decoupled from the cloud access, because maybe they can't hit the cloud anymore, the cloud account, but that Lambda function's still in there. So, but we still have this hurdle of AWS IAM credential renewal, right? That hour-long limitation. So start thinking to myself, well, again, Screenshots right off of AWS's website. How can my application trigger an AWS Lambda function directly? Well, you can invoke a Lambda. I'm reading this because I'm assuming you can't. You can invoke a Lambda function using a custom event through AWS Lambda's Invoke API. Really? Cool. Only the function's owner and another AWS account that the owner has granted permission can invoke the function. Well, okay, we're still operating within those parameters. How do I invoke the AWS Lambda function over HTTPS? You see where this is going? You can invoke a Lambda function over HTTPS by defining a custom RESTful API using Amazon API Gateway. This gives you an endpoint for your function which can respond to REST calls like GET, PUT, and POST. Read more about using AWS Lambda with Amazon API Gateway. Click here. So, how about we do something like this? How about we set up an AWS API Gateway endpoint that I'm going to use the exact same function before. I'm just going to have the API Gateway call it now, and because it's returning those credentials I dumped, right? You can see where it's going, right? So, and I'll get to a screenshot here in a minute and show you, but what about if we do the same, but we want to do reconnaissance? Again, maybe we don't want just those credentials, but maybe we want to start scripting calls that, for lack of a better term, tunnel through the Lambda function and start looking at services that it has access to on the back-end cloud. Pretty cool. Again, some of those ideas, Andrew Krug and, I'm sorry, I forget the other guy's name, Rich, I've mentioned them at the beginning, right? They've done some really cool research, and they've created some really cool scripts that will go out and do that. So I'm thinking, wow, just plug those in. I've got remote access. I don't even need to be an employee anymore. I can still, I can still access this. Let's suppose that that Lambda function can access S3 buckets. Let's suppose that there's sensitive data in those S3 buckets. Well, maybe they've got them locked down to the internet and we can access them directly. But if that Lambda function can hit it, I can exfil that data now. Wonderfully over HTTPS too. So again, I know maybe this may be difficult to see because of the light. Apologies to one anticipating it, but it's just a real simple web browser access to the API gateway that's calling my Lambda function that's returning the credentials and spitting them out on a web browser. Same thing. I'm no longer an employee somewhere, but I still have these credentials of that Lambda function, which I can go happily copy and paste into my AWS CLI credentials file. Problem was, okay, these are all great. And I'm already beginning to think and carrying on this research. What can we do with some sort of command and control? Could this be turned into some sort of botnet? What else could we do with this? Well, those are all great. What I really want to do is log in and be able to interact. I mean, doing these system calls that kind of don't really work anymore. Those are great, but it's kind of a spray and pray approach. I really want that interactive access. So, what's better than a reverse shell? So I'm hoping this video, it's just a 3-minute quick video. I'm hoping it'll pop up. Did it come up? Okay, let me see. Maybe it's another slide down. I'll put it back in if I have to. Can I switch over to a browser, or is it going to mess everything up? Whiskey. Roll the dice, huh? Let me see. Maybe I'm just okay. Let me see if I can. So I can't see. Oh, here we go. It won't let me click on it though. How about we do this? Okay, let me do one other thing here. Lambda. No internet connection. Let me see here. You kidding me? Hold on.
A random URL like smu.edu.
Yeah, I'm just gonna use my own web. Be faster. This will probably be a better resolution anyway, so. There we go. Oh, I know what it is. I had my SOCKS 5 on still, sorry. Oh, are you kidding me? I gotta sign in too? Oh, man. Let me see if I can get it going back over here then. Hopefully this will work. Nope. Hold on. I don't know if it's going to allow me to do it in full screen. You want to wait with me while I log in? All right, just a minute. What are we on time? Oh, we got plenty of time. All right. Bear with me. Skype for Business. What's that stuff? What did I say? Reverse shell. Sorry, it's an unlisted URL for obvious reasons, so. Sorry, guys. I had to reboot just as a troubleshooting measure for, Yep, I'm that guy. Come on, LastPass, there we go. Told you I was that guy. And I'm not. All right, woohoo! All right, here we go. So I'm gonna pause it here real quickly, and hopefully it'll buffer this a little bit, as it will be a little clearer. So before I execute it, what I've done here is I'm making OS calls, but it's not os.system, it's os.dupe. And I'm binding to standard in, standard out, and standard error file descriptors. And I'm essentially binding a bash shell to those, which then I open a TCP socket connection back out to a Kali Linux client I've got, coincidentally, also running in AWS. It usually will clear up here in just a sec, but basically what I'm showing here is the code. This is my Kali Linux client. I'm setting up a netcat listener on 1337. There we go. I'm going to test it, showing that it's testing. I'm going to go back to the Kali. Now I've got a shell on the Lambda container. So who am I? I'm SBX_user1057. I'm going to grep for that in etc password. It shows that my login shell is sbin no login. So clearly I shouldn't be logged in right now. I'm catting etc password, and you can see all the usernames are prefixed SBX. Any idea what that might be for? Sandbox, yeah, exactly, right? But there's tons of them. I'll let this carry on a few more minutes. So what I'm showing here is that root has login shell for bin bash, and then a user called EC2 user has a login shell bin bash. sbin ifconfig-a. So it's got three interfaces. It's got a local loopback. It's got one called vinternal_3. It has vtarget_2. Based on my research, they changed. I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself, but let that play out a little bit more. netstat-rn to look at the routing table. Default route is going to be 169.254.76.6, which is on that vinternal_3 interface. Uname A. So it shows that it's running, actually, I think I've got these in the next slide. I'll just let it run on. Just doing some basic reconnaissance. Now here's where it gets interesting. Here's the process. As you can see right here, is my cursor showing up? Yeah. There's only three processes. There's a Python process that's called a script called bootstrap.py. There's also bash, and then, of course, the PS command that I just issued. So I'm going to head on over to var runtime AWS Lambda, and I'm going to scroll through this bootstrap.py. There's a lot of stuff going on here. I've chosen not to do a completely full disclosure at this point because well, as it'll show right here, this file is copyrighted 2013 Amazon, so.
Were you able to grab the shadow file too?
The shadow file? So no, that's, because this is running as a non-privileged user, the SBX sandbox user, non-privileged. So that's another good point. There's no sudos, there's no su, there's nothing like that installed, right? So there may be some other ways to get around that, but this is where I'm at currently. So good question though, thanks. Let this play on. We're at a little bit, about 5 more minutes, good. So interestingly, in that same directory, and I kind of had discovered this looking at the bootstrap.py file, it's making calls to functions that aren't defined in that, and those functions are defined in this runtime.so shared object compiled Python library. So this is basically just running file on that. It's reporting that it's an ELF 64-bit, least significant bit shared object on an x64 platform. sysv, dynamically linked, not stripped, so on and so forth. And then, again, what I was showing earlier, I'm going to export all the variables, and I'm just demonstrating here the access key, the security access, or secret access key, I'm sorry, the security token, and then the session token. Again, that's what we were using earlier to export and access. So at that point, just exit out of the shell. It says that the function completed. There's your billing cycle and whatnot, so on and so forth. So try to get back here. Where did I leave off? All right. Come on. Come back, come back, come back. Oh, that was a good. Oh. Stop teasing, stop teasing. Oh man, it's flashing on the screen now. All right, we may need to do this. How about I just do this? Cool?
You're back.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not full screen either, so. All right, that's cool. So we left there, and I went here. Yeah, so this is the function that I called to get the reverse shell. It's, again, I'm just using OS calls, opening a socket, binding a call to bin bash to that sub process. This is the video. We'll skip past that. So what we now know, the OS is a containerized Amazon Linux image, likely from AWS ECS, Elastic Container Service. It's kernel 4451-40.67.amazon1.x86_64 with symmetric multiprocessing support. It's a mouthful. It's compiled on June 23rd, 5:04 p.m. UTC 2017. Now, granted, this was filmed at the beginning of September, so they may have new kernel at this point, but the network, from what I can tell, is dynamically assigned IP, so it's using some form of DHCP. The interface names, from, again, my research, do not change. They're always called vinternal_3 and vtarget_2. And then vinternal_3 is going to be at 169.254.76.x/23. That x is going to change. vtarget_2 is going to always, from what I can tell again, is going to be at 79.1/32. Default gateway is 76.6. Now, there's also, make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself here. I am. Okay. Users, the only two interactive login shells are root and EC2. Runtime usernames follow that nomenclature, SBX, user, number. what sort of services. We've got an X-ray daemon that always resides at 79.2. And then we've got those 3 files that we looked at, bootstrap.py, runtime.so, the shared object library. And then they have another thing called the WSGI-PY. It's a web server gateway interface written in Python. So what's under the, sorry for the display here. So what's under the hood? The actual runtime, right? That's really what I'm curious to know. And most importantly, can we take control of that and manipulate it? So and this is also going to probably be hard to see. I'd be happy to show it to you offline. But this, again, is what I catted out when I was on the reverse shell. It's the bootstrap.py. And again, respecting Amazon and their intellectual property, I'm not going to show all of it, but what was interesting is that it's calling this function, where was that? It's called wait for start. So wait for start over here, which is defined in bootstrap.py, then calls another one, lambda runtime dot receive start. Now receive start, that's where I was like, well, that's not defined in here. Where is it? That is defined in that shared object file. So I start poking around through the shared object file, decompiling, disassembling, looking for things. Again, I don't want to over-disclose just quite yet, but there's some interesting strings in there. There's one called secret with a value of KEY. There's other interesting artifacts and tidbits like which the path where this was originally stored, the source, what it was compiled with, glibc 225. So, really where I want to take this next is, again, I want to see if this is botnettable, if there's some sort of command and control. What sort of additional foothold can we gain through the services that we can access through these Lambda functions? And then, just here at the end, this is the mitigation. Again, the point I stressed on early on was this assumes that these permissions have been granted already, and that's not unusual for them to be lax. So stick with the least privileged need to know. I know it's going to be a pain in the butt at times. In a very complex cloud environment, we have multiple teams working on stuff, but try to do your very best. It truly is a science. Yeah, AWS IAM, it's really, really cool tool, but you have to learn it to be able to use it well. Disable or revoke privileges if it's possible. There's always that consideration you want to make if it's going to break something in your build pipeline or lock yourself out of something within the cloud environment itself. Monitoring. If you have the resources, go in and do some sort of a peer review on the Lambda functions. Make sure they're not calling reverse shells or exporting credentials over an API gateway, simple things like that. CloudTrail and CloudWatch are good places, even though we were able to spoof our identity as the Lambda function itself. There's still specific IOCs that you can start looking for within those trails. So, if you can set up monitoring using Splunk or Kibana, what have you. There's tons of tools to do it, right? Start monitoring that. Start looking at that. Start combing through it when you get the chance. So that's about it. Again, I'm going to keep working on this. I hope to follow up on some of the local meetups. Please come out to Dallas Hackers Association on the first Wednesday of the month. I host my own North Texas Cybersecurity Group last Thursday of the month. And then, of course, DC 214, the local DEF CON chapter, is on the second Wednesday of the month, Whiskey? Yeah. Yep, second Wednesday.
There's also Hack Fort Worth.
Hack Fort Worth, there's ISSA, there's tons, but those are the 3 that I typically go to because they're in the vicinity of where I live. So, and I always end my presentation with, oh, it's going to mess it up. There we go. Shrink it down. That's my avatar, so I always like to throw that at the end just to kind of catch people off guard. But again, thanks very much for coming out, giving me your time. I'm available for what, 8 minutes for Q&A-ish? Cool. Yes? They might be. I have to again, because it's, yeah. Yeah, let me see where I stand after this talk.
Okay, so like it's safe to say like within a month maybe your slides are going to be available?
I can make the slides available immediately. There's nothing that's inherently risky about that. You know how to go get that now, right? So, yeah. Yes?
So would you have access for 1 hour, the 60 minutes, or were you able to extend that longer? The key for 60 minutes, or for 60, yes, I think it was 1 hour, right?
Right, so there's two time constraints. One is the Lambda function itself will only execute for 300 seconds, but the security keys, the access keys that it uses to access resources are alive and well for an hour period, and then it cycles through. So a way around the Lambda limitation itself is to be able to export those keys, and then that gives you an hour. You need new keys. Well, if you're using API Gateway, refresh the page, you got new keys, change them out. And,
Okay, that part I didn't
yeah,
understand.
yeah.
That's why they said you couldn't do bad things in 1 hour.
Yeah, and really what I want to do is I want to build out maybe like a, I don't know, server client interface for that, where I could just, get, and it returns the keys, and now I've automatically got I've got a local shell that's acting as a remote one, if that makes sense.
So are you familiar with AWS Inspector?
Yes.
Config checker, does that check any of this?
I don't think so. I think that's looking more kind of generally like security best practices from an AWS perspective. This is kind of, if I do say so myself, it's a little more cutting edge that they're probably not looking at it quite yet. So.
Well, and it's interesting that it comes out as the Lambda user in your CloudTrail and CloudWatch.
Yeah. Well, you're using its credentials, right? Yeah. So that's the part where you can be a little bit surreptitious.
Do you do any exploration of the Node or Java or other runtime environments that are available with Python?
Yeah, Python, like I said, it was mostly because I was like wanting to learn Python for some other stuff, and then I was really interested. I heard a lot of really cool stuff at a company I was working at. They were doing a lot of Lambda work. I was like, I want to learn how to do that too, right? And then naturally the security hacker mindset of inside me is like, what can I do to abuse it and make it do unintended things? So yeah.
Can't take you anywhere.
Can't argue with that. Anything else? Great. Well, thanks again for your time. I'll be outside if you have any questions. Come by and play CTF if you haven't started yet. Cheers. Thanks. I don't know how to turn this off. Oh, mute.
Hello. Okay. Cool. I think I'm ready whenever.
Okay. Okay, hello everybody. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Roddie. You're in.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming, so I'm going to dive right in. My coworker told me I'm supposed to have an introduction slide so you believe I'm a credible source of this knowledge. So like he mentioned, I'm a grad student currently at SAM Houston. Before that, I got my degree in mathematics. And right now I'm working as a cybersecurity analyst at the Texas Department of Public Safety. And most relevant to this talk, I have Asperger's syndrome. So just to give a quick outline, what I want to do with this talk is I'll do a brief introduction, go into the problem, my problem statement of my talk, provide evidence as to why evidence of teams leveraging neurodiversity, how we can solve the problem, and how managers and coworkers can adapt to assist individuals with these conditions. So my focus is going to be on high-functioning autism, but really the reason I titled my talk Leveraging Neurodiversity is because any neurodiverse individual can contribute to a team of typically neurotypical individuals. So I wanted to start with this quote by Steve Silverman, who's considered an expert on autism research, because I thought it would connect well with my audience here. It says one way to understand neurodiversity is to think of in terms of human operating systems. Just because a PC is not running Windows doesn't mean that's broken. I'd argue that because a PC is running Windows, it's broken, but I'll stick with his quote. So high-functioning autistic individuals typically exhibit traits such as this and technical difficulties. Or it doesn't want to connect. Yeah, temporarily, at least. They exhibit high productivity, extreme attention to detail. They're typically logical and calculated, highly passionate about the work they do, and hyper-focused on any task they're assigned. As I said, these are high-functioning autistics. So the problem that I've identified, or I believe that's the issue, has nothing to do with intelligence or anything like that. It's simply social and behavioral difficulties, and that's causing a high unemployment rate among high-functioning autistics. The statistic is that individuals with autism there's only about 10% of individuals with high-functioning autism who are employed currently, and honestly, that's not due to their inability to work. It is the social and behavioral issues and disabilities connected to the condition. So I want to give a few examples of how I may come off as a difficult individual, and of course, no, it's my adapter is a piece of junk. Well, I guess I'm going to Best Buy this weekend. So one of the things that typically annoys people the most about me is I have some volume control issues. I talk as if I'm presenting to a large audience in general conversation. I get a lot of, quiet down, I can hear you fine. So it gets frustrating for me, like, to hear that, to be told to be quiet. I deal with it. I know I have the issue, though. I just, at the time, don't realize that I'm acting like this. I also am very, very blunt. I will tell you what I am thinking. It's amazing I have a fiance because I'm pretty verbally abusive sometimes. I will tell him what I think. So it's an issue. I tend to offend people. It seems like I'm being rude, but I honestly don't have an issue with telling people what I believe. I also have some phrasing issues, so that comes into play a lot at work. I'm trying to backtrack a lot with what I say often, but my coworkers enjoy it probably more than anything. And the other thing, I'm almost done with my graduate degree. I have several certifications. I'm only 20 years old, and I almost have 2 degrees, but adulting is hard. Adulting is very hard for me. AC problems are a nightmare. Car problems, just, they can't happen. I've taken long breaks from driving just because, again, nightmare. So I find it very hard to adult despite being able to educationally have some big accomplishments. So I'm not coming here with some personal belief that there are no issues. I'm coming here and I want to bring evidence. Exhibit A is there are technology companies already accomplishing this. SAP noticed that, identified the statistic that 1% of the general population, of the world population, has autism. So their question was, if 1% of the world has autism, why can't 1% of their company have autism? So they've built an Autism at Work program and are hoping to have that 1% by 2020. They're not the only ones. Microsoft, New Relic, HP, and more have autism hiring programs that assist autistic employees in moving into a full-time role, a full-time job, and adjusting to that which could be difficult. And so they help them in exchange get the abilities they've identified. One of my favorite is the Israeli Army's Visual Intelligence Division, also known as Unit 9900. So in Israel, there's obligatory military service when you turn 18. You go into the military for several years of service, minimum 2-3 years. And individuals with autism were being exempted for this and being told, don't do it, we don't need you, basically. But they soon realized that there was a lot of high-functioning autistic individuals who wanted to serve in the military. It's what all their peers of their age are doing, and they didn't see any reason they couldn't. But there was still some concerns in military leadership whether these individuals would be able to function in such a job. So what they did is they created a unit. They realized the attention to detail associated with high-functioning autistics and the ability to hyper-focus for long periods of time. So they decided to make a unit full of these individuals that would sit at a desk all day, every day, 24/7, and monitor satellite images to see changes over time that could indicate forces moving, potential suspicious objects. And these individuals enjoyed doing it. Typically, a person would enjoy sitting at a computer all day, every day, just looking for simple changes, but these individuals were good at it and they're passionate about doing it. And the thing that's really amazing is after a while of this program being open, the military leadership realized, these individuals aren't really that difficult to work with. There's some small adjustments. They need to be taught certain social skills, but overall, it wasn't that much harder to adjust. So they're now being brought into full military service, general military service to work with others, while the Israeli army helps them adjust to adult and social life in exchange for their skills and their work life. One of the companies, I actually talked with the founder of Aspertise a few weeks ago. I love what this company is doing. Their full service is on, they provide cybersecurity, quality assurance, software development services. I want to provide a few quotes from their website homepage. They're a digital service company that focuses on the development of a professional environment that allows atypical individuals, Asperger's, autism, high IQ, to highlight their high technology skills for traditional companies. The quote I like even more, that for different and innovative vision of IT beyond the traditional perimeters with very expert profiles and closer to the machine. My nickname in my office is Megantron because I can be robotic in my work, pretty precise, attention to detail, hyper-focus. So I'm closer to a machine sometimes when I work. I pump tasks out quick, so it's a great quote and it's very true. And Aspertise is not the only company doing this. Specialist Turn, Non-Parietal Institute, who I found out their office is in the building right next door to this one. So that's pretty cool. Specialist Guild, Empirical, Auticon. All these companies either train individuals in IT with high-functioning autism in IT, teaching them both adult life skills, social skills, while also teaching them information technology and cybersecurity and other like things, programming. Or they're companies that their workforce is typically fully neurodiverse, and they contract out those individuals and hope those individuals work in other companies. So now that I've both shown that I can be very different socially and behaviorally, and provided examples of companies that are successfully employing these individuals, I wanted to get into the solution of how can any other manager, coworkers, any other company do this. At a high level, the solution is you need to be aware. You need to look at the benefits that these individuals bring instead of focusing on the disabilities. I'm not saying there's not disabilities and challenges you're going to encounter. The truth is there is. That's the whole point of this talk is in the reason that these individuals are being overlooked at times. But if you get in that mindset of focusing on the benefits, you will realize that you want to employ these individuals. You also need to be adapting for the employee. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not a hard thing. It's just learning the little things that affect an employee and changing for them. I want to get into the details of what I mean by adapting for the employee. Simply forget how you manage your neurotypical employees. It's not going to work. That may sound difficult or challenging or just annoying that you would have to change, but as I said, you're going to get the benefits. I want to start with an example of these little things that are differences. So let's say you have an employee, any employee comes with you and they're like, I have this great idea and I want to work on this project, but it's not a great time. There's no bandwidth or resources available at this time, despite how good an idea it is or might be. What you'd say to a neurotypical employee, maybe, great idea, let's reapproach that when we have more resources. Remind me about it when we're less busy. That won't work. What you need to say is, great idea, let's reapproach that. Remind me in a couple weeks. So it's really that keyword of couple weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Tell me to approach you in a year and a half. It's not about the time period specifically, but about giving that clarity. Because I'm not as good as a normal employee may be able to think less busy. They maybe identify that less busy time. They may be able to figure out how often you should be an appropriate time. Whereas I'm going to start stressing, like, one, I can't identify when less busy is at times. Like, I may have brought it because I think we're not busy. I may not be able to identify like you can that it's a stressful time for the office. The ambiguity also of less busy is very stressful. I like specifics. I like being told a few days, a few weeks, a few months. And as you can see, that's a two-word difference. Like, this is not a huge change. This is not big accommodations. This is just identifying those key phrasings that you have to do in order to assist. So that was easy. So another high level, what do we need? We need structure and routine. We need clarity where possible. We need patience and understanding. But what you're going to get is you're going to get high productivity. You're going to get very thorough, detailed work. And one of the most important things, I think, is you're going to get a dedicated, passionate employee who's going to do the best they can every day. So this is one of those times I wish I could read minds. And you guys thinking, how is she going to work Whataburger into a security conference and a talk on neurodiversity? So this is a kind of personal story. I like routine. I like things to happen the same way. I like plans. I work in an incident response environment. No matter how much I plan, the hackers don't plan like I do. They don't work on my schedule. They will attack. I'm going to have to drop everything and respond for who knows how many hours. And like in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm working on this project. But I know that's not how it works. Incident response is my primary role. So there's a Whataburger right by my office, and my employees just think I'm unhealthy, and, well, that's fun. Seizure warning was not included in my presentation. Maybe. So every morning, I go to the Whataburger by my office. I get a cinnamon roll, I get a large soda. The employees, I've been doing this for a year, 5 days a week, and the employees at Whataburger are the best. Now I just like pull my car into the parking lot, they see it, and I walk in, swipe my card without saying anything, and they hand me my cinnamon roll. It's the best. And so even though I know during the day, it's not necessarily going to go how I planned it, which can be stressful for me, I know that that one thing is going to be constant. So that's something that I learned myself, but I'm telling you this so that if there's an employee, neurodiverse employee, that seems to be struggling with, in an IR environment, with this change in schedule when maybe they're used to school and classes were at a specific time, they went to the library at a specific time. Encourage them to identify something they can keep constant, such as a morning routine. Maybe they bring their lunch and eat at the same time at their desk every day. I get bored easily, very, very easily. There's a reason I'm doing grad school and doing extracurricular studying, several certifications, all while holding a full-time job. And I knew something was going to go wrong. I didn't know what. Yeah? Okay, well, then I'm glad it's not just me. It'll come back on eventually. So my point of being bored is when I get bored, I struggle more socially, behaviorally. I get annoyed, I get stressed. It doesn't work well for anyone. I get grumpy, meltdowns or shutdowns. It's not a good situation. But what you need to identify is not think about the characteristics that come with me being bored, but take advantage of that. Give me lots of work to do. If I'm bored, give me any task. Like, I do requisition orders. I write procedures. It's not because I like requisition orders. Like, there's other people who can do it, but it's because I get bored, and a requisition order is something. It's something to keep me busy. I'd rather do that. I mean, most employees, they get bored, and they're like, yeah, I can watch YouTube at my desk. It's time for Facebook. But work is work. I want to do work. I don't want to sit around. So I really encourage you to use something like that to your advantage, because you can pretty much assign me anything when I'm bored, and I'll do it. And it's not going to come back on, is it? Spent so much time on this presentation.
Hey, one's on the way.
Okay. Have a new adapter coming. Back up. Okay. It'll eventually work. Well, I'll go to my next slide. You'll just miss the cat meme I had on there. So another thing, like I said, clarity. I don't do well with being handed something and run with it. I like to be told how to do it. Problem is, that's not going to get me for life. So even though I'm going to tell you, be clear with these employees, do the best you can to be specific, I know that's not going to be the way it is always. Also, even though I may be lucky at this time to work in an environment where people understand that and give me step-by-step, I'm not going to have that my whole life. So even though at times I want you to be specific, especially if it's a critical task, I don't want to have to work through it. I do encourage you to assist the employee to enable themselves, because in the future I may not be as lucky, and I would have rather learned those skills from people, managers who took into account my certain disabilities and helped me with it. So, and that's pretty much goes with any of these things I'm talking about. I'm not necessarily saying just assist these employees, walk away, done. I do encourage you to help them enable themselves wherever possible. Let's see if this works. Guess I need to go write an Amazon review tonight. Or maybe it is just this monitor, because this is not helping much. Well, maybe the system. It flashed. It adjusted. All right, cool. I can blame AV instead myself. It's good. We'll keep moving on. Doesn't matter, I don't have a USB anymore. No?
You just gotta be patient, it takes a second. Here we go. Fingers crossed. There we go.
Perfect. That works. Let me get my clicker back. disk SD. Does it have a password?
No, just hit cancel.
Oh, okay.
There's probably a card in the reader.
There we go. I also get obsessed with things. I don't show interest in things. I get obsessed with topics. I think it's better now than when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I got obsessed with stupid stuff. I think for a while it was Ripley's Believe It or Not. About 2 years of Doctor Who obsessions. But now I tend to develop interests related to my work because my work is what I do all day. And so in the evenings, I enjoy continuing that. Most people like to go to the bar after work and relax. I enjoy continuing what I was doing in work, but in a learning capacity. Again, this is something that instead of considering disability, which some people would, I like to talk about my interests a bit too much. Use this to your advantage. If you see an employee getting really interested, for example, in memory forensics, instead of just letting them roll with it, encourage them to explore, learn more, give them resources, and then you've got an expert in memory forensics. Because also ingest this information really quickly so you can create an expert, a SME, out of these employees because I will go home and study it. I won't just stick with my 8 hours and be done. This is a recommendation I'm going to give to every manager, not just for your neurodiverse employees, but also for your neurotypical employees. You should be a mentor to your employees. One of the things that's been really beneficial is with my managers, once every 3 months, sit down at lunch for 30 minutes, if you can dedicate those 30 minutes of your time. Because a lot of times there will be issues at work and that I'm not realizing, because a lot of times you may assume that I notice it and just can't control it, but a lot of times I'm not even noticing it. So if you can sit down with me for 30 minutes and say, this month I saw this thing, and this thing that I'd prefer you work on, give me recommendations to work on it. In 3 months I'll come back, and I hope that, and in a lot of cases it is the case, that's like, good job working on that. I've really seen some growth in that, because I can learn, I can adjust for some things, but if I don't know what I'm doing, then there's obviously no way I can know what I need to adjust. That's the end of my talk. I want to thank you all for coming. I know it was a pretty short talk. I developed this talk as a 20-minute talk, tried expanding it, but clearly it didn't work too well. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah?
How do you feel about annual performance reviews?
Oh, I love them. I think they're great, especially for neurodiverse employees. Same reason as being a mentor, I need to know where to improve. And performance reviews are a great structured way for you to tell me where I can improve. And like, I understand because of these disabilities, I have a lot of areas for improvement. Like, at first I may get frustrated if there's something you say, and it may seem like that, but like, it's really good to know where I can adjust. I want to know where to adjust. I don't want to just accept my disabilities or not notice them and continue on behaving that way. So.
Do you have any tips for someone that might be giving a performance review, like what should they consider?
The biggest thing to consider is that fact that I may not know. Don't be like, oh, you've been doing that terrible, why would you do that? You need to be like, have you noticed this? Or like, if you haven't noticed, may I recommend you do this? It's a lot of just understanding that I may not notice. The same thing with me talking loud. Like, yeah, you probably do need to tell me, even if I may get frustrated, because I'm not noticing it at the time.
And give specific examples.
Yeah.
And also specific recommendations. On
Yeah, exactly. And if you can't, that's another thing. Like, you may say, oh, you've been doing this, but like, I want you to tell me, like, I noticed like the other day, 2 days ago in this situation, you did this, that's an example, and you should have done it this way. Yeah?
How do you feel about self-identifying as a disability?
Oh, what do you mean by self-identifying?
So a lot of places you have to identify
Oh.
you have a disability. And
Yeah.
for me, it's been very difficult because
Yeah.
I typically work consulting or contract positions.
Exactly. So I don't like the requirement to identify. So after I gave this talk at DEF CON, I got a lot of messages on Twitter from people, positive messages, thank you for giving this talk, it's a great thing to talk about. But there's a common theme of, I don't want to tell my employer because what if they change the way they look at me? Or I've told employers in the past they treated me differently, it's terrible. And there are companies that are going to do this. And that's why I want to give this talk, tell you like, that's not how we want to be treated. There's things you can do to help me adjust. The requirement to identify is one that I don't really agree with because sometimes these individuals, like, they do struggle with it. I'm very open about it, but individuals do struggle, and I think that they need to come to that decision to tell their employer that. Yeah. And again, if a manager's having issues, like with other employees, they're going to say something, and maybe that's the point where, like, sorry, I've been doing that, and explain. So being forced upon employment to list it out, I don't necessarily agree with. If you need accommodations like a physical disability might, then it makes sense. But besides that, yeah, that's my opinion. Yes?
Can you put the list of companies back up?
Yeah. Somewhere in here. Oh. Okay, I'm blaming AV. Yeah. I definitely can. I'll find a place to host them, and I can share them on Twitter. At Megan_Roddie. So my name with an underscore. Yeah. Yes.
So I can personally vouch for everything that Megan is saying because I was the lucky manager that had the opportunity to hire Megan. And I'll tell you right now that I've never grown more as a manager than in the period of time that I was learning from Megan about how Megan was unique. And I also very quickly realized how much she brought to my team. And so it was a very cool thing. But I wanted to say something for anyone in the room that might be in this position, right? Maybe you manage someone who's, or you're over someone who's neurodiverse, or even you're neurotypical. But you also have another responsibility that Megan didn't cover, but I've had to learn. You have a responsibility to make sure that while you may be open-minded, because you're in this talk, you're obviously open-minded to learning and expanding your understanding. Not everyone else in your organization may be that way. Maybe not even other people that are on this team, right? Peers or other teams. You have a responsibility to make sure that fair treatment is being given in all directions, right? So I find my place in, I find opportunities to sometimes remind other people in the organization that maybe they didn't like maybe something that Megan said, and so they took a different path. And like, no, you need to understand something. This is just how her life works. It doesn't make her wrong. It doesn't. So sometimes, as a manager, that's a responsibility that you must keep in mind, or else it can become a very overwhelming experience for the person that's having to deal with it, right? Negativity or people that just don't want to.
I'm going to second everything you said. I've had an SRE that worked for me for many years, and I've encountered many of those same challenges. And he was brilliant, but at the same time, he had the ability to piss off his peers just like that. So it's a learning experience for everybody. And seeing it presented
That front row just gave an amen.
But you know what? I'll tell that front row that while, yes, sometimes maybe volume gets on your nerves or whatever, guess what? She's about the equivalent of 3 of you, right? So
Fill out your own requisition orders.
Tolerate and appreciate, because she does so many things for this team that you guys don't even want to do. And it is a good. We have a good team, and I'm not. My guys are totally fair. Yeah. But sometimes it just takes that reminder of, hey, look, don't forget the value that she brings to this team. She deserves to be treated the exact same way.
No.
Even if she hurts your feelings. That's all we do.
You're all grown men. Accept it. No, and I forget to mention that because I'm pretty pessimistic. I accept humans are crappy people, so I ignore those people. I saw some more questions. Yep.
Well, for my son's eye function,
Yeah.
and my experience in our company with
Mhm.
Legacy HP
Yeah, HP was one of my mentions.
Some of our highest functioning employees are autistic.
Yeah.
CD, ADHD, work within our incident response team. We work almost exclusively at home, remotely.
Yep.
I don't see these people except on the road, and they're some of the most productive people we have.
Yeah.
My suggestion, anybody that, when you're dealing with people with those disabilities, if you use that word, I don't know what the correct word is, that's what I use.
Oh, I don't know what the politically correct word is.
That's what I use.
Yeah. Those YouTube haters tell me I'm politically incorrect.
My suggestion is remember that people are episodic. Everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And
Yep.
that's what you were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
2 weeks or a month.
Yep.
Everything has a beginning, middle, and end. It's like a export kit. It starts, goes real high, and comes down real quick.
Yep.
Those meltdowns and those episodic things that happen can be from a minute, from 0 to 100, back to minus 0
Mhm.
or less than a minute. You just
Exactly.
have to be open to that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely.
Well, Scripture tells us when we are here about service, and we're service to all of our employees, it doesn't matter what role they're in, we should try to help each other as best we can. It's
Yeah.
better for the team, better for the company.
You can ask my fiance over there, like, 1 second I'm happy, and then I'm throwing stuff across the room, and then I'm all bright and sunny again, so.
We will make it happen.
Yeah. All right, anything else? Question? Yep.
So those companies you listed earlier with large autistic workforces,
Mhm.
do you know if there are autistic people in the higher level management of any of those companies?
I can't speak to statistics on management. I think if there's not, well, one, I think a lot of autistic individuals do accept, and I'm not saying it's everyone, but there is a large number of autistic individuals who accept that management is not the place they're supposed to be. And I mean, same with the general population, neurotypical. There's not every individual suited, but especially among this population, and I've accepted it. I don't need to manage. Management is a social thing. In some companies, management is a political thing, and I don't really care for that. Like I said, I don't know the statistics on employment or management levels in these companies. I'm not saying it's impossible. There's plenty of individuals that may have the social skills to do that. I'm also, and I believe this is the same, I enjoy the technical work. I don't want to manage. I don't want to sit in meetings 8 hours a day. I would quit my job if I was in meetings 8 hours a day, honestly. So I also think if there is a small number, part of that is due to the individual's choice because they do enjoy the hands-on work rather than the management work, paperwork, reporting work. So, yep. Yes?
You're going to let me say something?
Sure.
My name's Cooney Beasley. Megan was in my high school. I was her principal. And she invited me here today. And I got to tell you, I'm so incredibly proud of her. Graduated at what, 15, 16?
16 by 5 days.
16 by 5 days. Graduated with 52
Shame.
hours of college credit. We were somewhat dubious in accepting her. We had an online program. And you'd be astounded compared to the way she's able to do a public speaking than she was the first time on the phone. I had a lot of empathy for her because I too have Asperger's. I'm on the spectrum. I also have several other things. I'm dyslexic, dysgraphic, dyscalculia, all of these other dys things. And we took a particular interest in Megan generally because she blew us out of our curriculum online. And she all of a sudden started saying, I want to do more and more. And I said, I don't know if you can handle this. Then there was a question of whether she should take dual credit courses. And I said, well, just throw her in the deep end of the pool and see if she can swim. And she did 10 laps. And so one of the things you're going to find out working with somebody who is on the spectrum, first you need to figure out where they are on the spectrum. And somebody asked a question about, a person in management or something. I'm a retired major from the Army. I was at 23, I was the youngest commander in the Army. And yes, and being AS and being in the Army and commanding is a good thing. I was also a football coach. I won the state championship in 1994. So people who can be focused in particular areas, who have AS and who are on the spectrum, they are an asset. They're an asset to your company. I don't consider it disability. I consider it an intellectual advantage. Superpower. Yeah, because once you plug these people in the right way, they're going to be your superheroes. They're going to be able to make the breakthroughs. You just have to be a person who's able to recognize the asset that you have, capacity of these people, and then feed them, and you're not going to be able to keep up with them. Just realize that that's going to happen. We had 2 schools in Houston that specifically focused on AS and Tourette's, and we had people jumping the tracks because your conventional education is too boring for them. We had to move them off of classroom and into program instruction, and once you got them in program instruction, they launched, they took off. They did 3 courses in a period of time. It would take an average kid to do 1 course because they're focused and they're good, and you don't have to grade their papers because they usually have all the correct answers. Thank you.
Thanks to Eric and Dr. Beasley for co-presenting today. Okay. If anyone has any questions for me after, I'll hang around for a few minutes. And I really want to thank you all. It was a great audience. I had some great questions. It's been a pleasure to speak. It's great to see so many people turn out for a talk. It's a non-technical talk, and it's a talk that some people would be controversial. So you've been a great audience.
get into that. It'll be fine. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure. It's supposed to be 4:30? Starting. everybody hear me all right? Yeah. All right, sweet. So this is PSAmsi, offensive PowerShell interaction with the AMSI, or anti-malware scan interface. We're going to be talking about some offensive use cases for interacting with AMSI, and I'll introduce a tool I wrote for doing that called PSAmsi. I'll do a really quick intro of myself, and then we can jump into it. So you may have seen some bash who am I intro slides earlier presentations today. Doing it in PowerShell is way cooler, so I'm going to do that. My name is Bryan Cobb. I work at the consulting company Protivity as a pen tester and consultant. I go by the handle Cobber or Cobber_IO on Twitter. The last thing you need to know about me is I don't claim to be an expert about any of this stuff by any means. I'm still new and just learning, but I think I also have a pretty neat tool to share with you guys today. So I really have two main goals with this presentation today. The first being to convince you that offensive PowerShell is not dead yet. So if you're kind of in the pen testing red team world really for the past year or so, a lot of really smart people have been making the case that offensive PowerShell is kind of dead due to its enhanced security features like logging capabilities, and as attackers we now have to worry about our malicious scripts being detected in memory due to things like the AMSI. And there's other languages out there that don't have the same protections as PowerShell. And those people are absolutely right. I'm sure things will be moving in that direction in the future, but I also don't think that we're completely out of the water with PowerShell threats just yet. I'm going to try to convince you of that in this presentation. Secondly, I'm going to try to convince you that your AMSI next-gen stream scanning antivirus is not a silver bullet. And I might be preaching to the choir a little bit on this point, but I think it's an important point for us to make, so I'm going to try to make it anyway. And to help me do that, I'm going to introduce a tool I wrote called PSAmsi, which is a tool for auditing and feeding AMSI signatures. So let's first talk about that first point. Is offensive PowerShell dead yet? So anyone seen the Monty Python and the Holy Grail movie? There's a little scene from that. I feel like this is kind of where we're at with offensive PowerShell right now, where there's a lot of people trying to just kill it off and call it dead, when maybe we're not quite there yet. But to understand why people are calling it dead, let's talk about some of the defense mechanisms that defenders have for protecting themselves against malicious PowerShell. The first of which being the AMSI, anti-malware scan interface, which allows AV products to scan, detect, and block malicious PowerShell and other scripting languages in memory. So not only just scanning files, but actually scanning the code as it's being executed in memory. And we'll dive into this further throughout the presentation. Secondly, PowerShell has a ton of built-in logging capabilities, probably the most important of which being script block logging, which essentially logs script blocks as they're being executed, which has the added benefit of unraveling some forms of obfuscation, such as base64 encoding, before it actually gets logged. Secondly, defenders have module logging, which can be extremely verbose and kind of hard to piece together, but is really useful when, in a post-breach scenario, when you need as much data as possible. And lastly, they have transcription logging, which can also capture the output of scripts as they're being run. Third, you can do command line logging to see PowerShell being started with suspicious flags like execution policy bypass and encoded command. And lastly, you can deploy what's called constrained language mode, which essentially only allows PowerShell to use a certain subset of functionality within PowerShell. And essentially, you're only going to be able to run Microsoft-signed CMDlets. Unfortunately, you kind of have to deploy a full application whitelisting solution for this really to be effective. But it's kind of the real answer for protecting against malicious PowerShell, so I definitely wanted to be sure to at least mention it. So, as an attacker, all of that logging and AV scanning starts to sound pretty intimidating. So why am I saying offensive PowerShell is not dead yet? Well, it turns out there are some limitations to those protections we talked about. Namely, if you're able to start PowerShell version 2, you've gotten around all of the logging, all of the AMSI, and all of that, just because they were introduced in later versions of PowerShell. The problem with that is that PowerShell version 2 is installed by default everywhere except now on Windows 10 and Server 2016. But most organizations have not actually moved to Windows 10 yet. And if they have, maybe they haven't actually enabled script block logging or not collecting those logs and monitoring them for threats. And lastly, most antiviruses have not actually implemented support for the AMSI yet, though luckily the default Windows Defender installation does implement support for it. But at this point, you might be thinking, okay, sure, if an organization is just being completely ignorant of PowerShell threats and are taking no steps to combat it, then they're kind of just asking for it at this point, right? So what about an organization that's doing everything right? They have somehow moved their entire organization to Windows 10. They've enabled script block logging across the enterprise. They are collecting their script block logs and monitoring them for threats. They bought a fancy endpoint protection agent that has AMSI support. This organization has to be safe, right? Well, to be clear, they are miles ahead of most organizations and definitely have a head start. But this organization is not necessarily safe from PowerShell threats yet. There are working AMSI bypasses in PowerShell, working script block logging bypasses, and attackers can use obfuscation to get around some of the signatures that defenders are looking for in their AV signatures or looking for in logs. And it turns out that these bypasses are actually really difficult to fix. PowerShell is a really powerful language and kind of gives you complete control over all the memory in the PowerShell process. So you can do things like overwrite variables and method implementations and really make it do whatever you want it to. So the real answer to stopping those bypasses is to use the constrained language mode that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, that can kind of be a tough sell to convince someone to implement a full application whitelisting solution. So as an attacker, most of the time we're going to be able to bypass the AMSI, but let's talk about how the AMSI actually works if it's not bypassed. So this is a nice diagram provided to us by Microsoft of how they envision the AMSI working. As you can see, there's like some applications there at the top that basically submit strings to Win32 API calls that eventually make calls to an anti-malware provider interface. So this is the same diagram, but my super dumbed down version of it. As you can see, just any application can submit strings to functions exported from the AMSI DLL, and that DLL will then make a call to the anti-malware provider, which provides signatures and tells you if it's malicious or not. An important point here is that this is actually anti-malware provider agnostic, meaning that theoretically any AV can register as the anti-malware provider and start providing signatures, and the AMSI will take care of the rest of this infrastructure. So any anti-malware provider can provide signatures, and any application can submit strings to be checked for malicious content. Well, at its core, that's what PSAmsi is an application that submits strings to the AMSI interface to see if that string is detected as malicious. Now, you might be thinking at this point, I thought this was supposed to be an offensive PowerShell module. Why are we submitting strings directly to the antivirus? Well, so PSAmsi uses the AMSI interface itself to enumerate AMSI signatures. And yes, will generate AV alerts, which might sound absurd at first, but just try to hang in there with me for a minute. So PSAmsi is a tool for auditing and defeating AMSI signatures, as I said earlier. And I first released this thing about a month ago at DerbyCon, but I have some fun new updates to share with you today. And so we're first going to talk about that auditing portion. So when I wrote PSAmsi, I made the strategic decision to only support PowerShell version 5 and up. And the reason for that is simply because the AMSI is only implemented in Windows 10 and in PowerShell version 5. So there's no real reason to maintain that backwards compatibility. I don't know if everyone here knows this or not, but PowerShell version 3 and up actually does stuff besides just logging. And I'm joking around a little bit because, at least as attackers, we're often very focused on keeping our payloads compatible down to PowerShell version 2 so that they will work on any version of Windows that has PowerShell. But I got to use PowerShell version 5 and I took full advantage. So the most basic component inside of PSAmsi is it exposes a PSAmsi scanner class just for conducting basic AMSI scans. And the way it does this is it calls those functions exported from the AMSI DLL. And it does this by using the PSReflect library written by Matt Graber. What it does, it creates an in-memory module of those functions, which is important because the typical way in PowerShell to call functions out of a DLL is to use the add type function, which creates temporary compilation files while it's doing it. And we don't want our traditional file scanning antivirus to get in our way when we're trying to enumerate in-memory signatures. So this is best explained with a demo. I have a bunch of pre-recorded demos, no live demos today, just because I'm not that elite yet, but maybe one day. So the first thing we're going to do is just import the PSAmsi module. You can see we set up a variable that points at an invoke mimicat script. And the first thing we're going to do is create a PSAmsi scanner, default constructor, no parameters, and take a look at what that looks like. A big benefit of being a class is that the scanner gets to maintain all this state. You can see all these properties that it maintains. And then to conduct a scan, we're just going to call the get PSAmsi scan result function with the word test. And you can see that it returns false, indicating the anti-malware provider did not detect that as malicious, like we would hope. So now this function can take strings, it can take script blocks, it can take file paths, and it can take URIs. So we're going to pass in a URI pointing at a malicious invoke mimicat script. You can see this one returns true, indicating the anti-malware provider did detect that as malicious, just like we would hope. In addition to being a class, there's also PowerShell symulets that are a bit easier to use in my opinion. It's doing the exact same thing using PowerShell symulets. Now let's take a look at what a scanner looks like after a couple scans. You can see it has an alert count property set to 1. It realizes that it has generated an AV alert by scanning the invoke mimicat script. And you'll see that Windows Defender pop up here in a second. And it also maintains this scan cache to remember things it's already scanned. There's that pop-up I warned you about. So that's some really basic AMSI scanning within PSAmsi. And there's really no reason that this class couldn't be used for defensive purposes. All it is a really easy way to conduct AMSI scans in PowerShell. So defenders, feel free to use that for that purpose. In addition to just scanning, we can actually find hidden signatures inside of scripts that are causing the script to be detected as malicious. And in my opinion, this is where PSAmsi starts to become really useful. So how do we do this? Well, again, PowerShell version 3 and up does stuff. It gives us the abstract syntax tree. An abstract syntax tree is basically just a way, a lot of different languages use this to parse and represent source code. But for us, it's just a really useful way to break down a script into logical chunks. And we can scan each of those chunks and find the minimally sized portions of a script that are being detected by the AMSI. So let's take a look at an example of this. This is a really stupid PowerShell function that doesn't do anything useful at all, but is going to be used for our example. So we'll take a look at what a tree for this script would look like. Our tree is going to start at the top with the root at the top, and the branches will extend downwards, just like in real life. So the root right there is going to be a node that contains all of the text of the entire script. It's going to have one child that also has contains all the text. That one's going to have two children, the function definition, and then the portion that calls the function. And this is going to continue all the way down the script, so you kind of get the idea. And this is just a really powerful way to represent a script, and is given to us for free by PowerShell. So now, anyone who's written a decent amount of PowerShell knows write host is evil. It's the worst, and it ruins everything in PowerShell. Don't use it. So what we're going to do is pretend that we have an anti-malware provider that detects the string right host num as malicious, that string that's highlighted up there. But when we're searching for signatures, we don't know that that's the signature yet, kind of cheating by telling you that it will be. So now we're going to search this tree to try to find that signature. So what we'll do is we'll scan every single node in the tree using that PSAmsi scanner class. So we scan the first one, and it comes back as detected because it contains that right host signature. So we're going to do this all the way down the tree until we get to here, where suddenly that one comes back as not detected, indicating that it doesn't contain the signature. So we'll do this for the entire tree, and basically what you'll see happen is we form this like subtree within the tree, like the detection tree. So all of the leaves of this detected tree are going to end up being our signatures. So luckily, to actually use this, you don't have to know how any of that works. You just run the function. So we'll take a look at the kind of signatures that Defender is looking for within this script. So this is an example of some output you might get. You'll get the starting position within the script, wherever the signature lives. You'll get the actual type of signature that it is, the AST type. And you also see here there's a PS token type. It turns out that comment blocks are not represented in the tree, so we have to scan those separately, which PSAmsi does for you. And then obviously you get the actual content of the signature. So let's take a look at what these signatures are actually look like. This signature, in my opinion, is a bit of a lazy signature. All it is an add member call that adds a property to an object, and it happens to be named virtual protect. So remember not to use that variable name in any of your PowerShell functions you're writing. It's not allowed. The second one is very similar, except it's called write process memory. This next one, at least in my opinion, seems to make a little bit more sense. What it is a Win32 API function that creates a remote thread injected into a process. If you're not familiar with how invoke Mimikatz actually works, it's basically a giant invoke reflective PE injection of the base64 encoded bytes of the Mimikatz binary. And so that's what this call is doing. Interestingly enough, when I first demoed this at DerbyCon about a month ago, there's 2 additional signatures that seem to have gone missing in the latest version of Windows that were actually the giant base64 encoded bytes of the binary. So if you're nerdy like me, you think that's interesting, and you can kind of track signatures over time using PSAmsi. And then there's 2 more signatures right here we'll take a look at. It's the full param block and the full comment block. So those are some examples of signatures that Windows Defender is looking for in PowerShell scripts. But if you'll remember, we said that the AMSI is actually anti-malware provider agnostic. So it turns out there's some other AVs that have some sort of AMSI support. And Lee Holmes tweeted out a list of some of the ones he's aware of that implement support or have some sort of claim for AMSI support. And you can see here in the list, there's 5 of them besides Defender. It happens to turn out that each of these have a free trial of their paid AV product. So of course, what do? I go download every single one to try to see how PSAmsi would actually fare against them. And I was pretty excited about this. I was hoping I'd find some really cool signatures that were maybe a bit more aggressive than what Windows Defender was searching for. And I'll have to say, I was a little bit disappointed in what I found. In my opinion, again, I'm a noob, so maybe I set them all up wrong. In my opinion, some of these AVs are being a bit deceptive when they say they've implemented AMSI support. And it's not all of them, and I don't want to point at any ones in particular, really, because I do want to encourage AVs to implement AMSI support. Because if you think about it, if a vendor is not on this list, That means they haven't even tried, which is almost worse. But it makes me a bit frustrated when AVs claim to have support to like get on some list on Twitter and then don't actually do it. So with that in mind, I added a function into PSAmsi so you could quickly verify if your anti-malware provider is doing what it says it's doing. It's just called test ICAR detection. If you're not familiar, ICAR is like a test string that's supposed to be detected by all AVs. So it does exactly what it sounds like. If you ever get this error using PSAmsi with a particular provider, it might be hard to read up there, but essentially what it's saying is when you go to make AMSI scans, there's several API functions you have to call. The first one being AMSI initialize, then AMSI open session, and then AMSI scan string. What this is saying is the call to AMSI initialize succeeded, the call to AMSI open session succeeded, but when we tried to call AMSI scan string, we got an error that it was not implemented. So if you're anything like me, you think that's a little bit sketchy. Someone's being a little bit deceptive when they say they've implemented support. And then the other case is like your provider implemented all the functions correctly, but when you go to scan anything, nothing is malicious. So we implemented AMSI support, but hey, nothing's malicious. It's all good to go. Don't worry about it. And then finally, if you get a provider that is doing what it says it's doing, you'll get back true, indicating that it detects it as malicious. So feel free to try that out on your own product. So that's the end of my rant on that subject. We've talked about auditing signatures and finding signatures. Let's talk about how we defeat those signatures. The way we're going to defeat signatures within PSAmsi is using obfuscation. So about a year ago, Daniel Bohannon released a tool called invoke obfuscation, which is basically like a PowerShell obfuscator. And I help him maintain invoke obfuscation now, which basically means that he wrote the entire thing and then I committed 2 lines of code and now I'm a contributor, so that's fun. But before we go into how PSAmsi actually uses invoke obfuscation, let's look at an example of obfuscation that defeats an AMSI signature. So we're going to use one of those signatures we were looking at earlier, that add member virtual protect signature. We'll scan it to verify it's detected, and it is. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to replace that virtual protect variable. We're just going to wrap it in curly braces, which is functionally equivalent in PowerShell, and is an example of something invoke obfuscation might do to obfuscate a variable. So now we'll scan the obfuscated string. It is no longer detected as malicious, indicating that we've defeated that signature using obfuscation. So now we're going to scan the Mimikat script one more time to see it's detected. And you know, we're not totally convinced that this AMSI thing actually works, so we're just going to try to download and run this thing anyway. And you can see we get no output. It doesn't work. We have a defender pop up. No luck there. So now what we'll do is we'll run it through PSAmsi's get mentally obfuscated function, which is going to go through each of the signatures it finds and obfuscate around every single one of them. And then we'll try to run the function. You can see it executes just fine. And then this is just showing you can actually pass in the signatures that we already found and won't have to find them again. There's a little bit of camera tricks going on here. These functions can take a little while to find signatures. So that just helps speed it up. The problem becomes when defenders get smart to all this obfuscation nonsense that we're doing, and instead of just trying to match on static signatures, they try to look for indicators of obfuscation itself. So this is the example script we were looking at earlier. When you run this through invoke obfuscation's like token all1 command, this is an example of some output you get. You and me as a human looking at that can immediately tell that something doesn't look right there. It just doesn't look normal. But how do we train a computer to actually recognize that? Well, Lee Holmes came up with an idea for that in a blog post he posted that uses character frequency analysis to detect PowerShell obfuscation. Because like what you saw is invoke obfuscation puts in a bunch of special characters that is not really typical to see inside of scripts. And Lee and Daniel put that rule into a collection of a much larger rule set that is basically a PowerShell obfuscation detector called revoke obfuscation. But how much do we actually need to obfuscate to get around these signatures? If our only goal is to get around those AMSI signatures, how much do we need to obfuscate? How good are these signatures, basically, is what we're asking. Well, earlier we saw we defeated 1 of 5 signatures by inserting 2 characters. So what if we used a stealthier form of obfuscation? And the biggest addition I'm making to PSAmsi and releasing today, by far, is abstract syntax tree-based obfuscation, which uses like an AST node's location within the tree as context for additional obfuscation options. And I use obfuscation in quotes here. You'll see why in a second when we go through this example script. This is another stupid PowerShell function that does nothing useful, but highlights a few of these obfuscation tricks we can do. But first, let's take a look how like the traditional PS token-based obfuscation works before we do the AST-based. Basically, the way it works is it iterates over every single token in the script and obfuscates them in isolation and then combines them all back at the end. So with that example script, we'd first get a command argument token and we'd say, okay, we know we can insert tick characters into this. We get this member token, oh, we can't insert ticks. We'll just like randomly uppercase and lowercase things. Strings, we can insert ticks. Members, just uppercase and lowercase. And it keeps going. Variables, we can do the curly brace and ticks. And it obfuscates each one in isolation, is essentially what we're getting at here. And it'll do this throughout the entire script until we get something crazy like this. And this thing right here is extremely good at defeating AMSI signatures. In fact, I haven't seen a single signature that this doesn't defeat. But whenever you start doing obfuscation detection, it's able to detect this really easily because we're inserting special characters and things just don't look normal. So where abstract syntax tree-based obfuscation differs a little bit, we'll go through an example of that. So this is just a subtree inside of the entire tree of the script, just because it doesn't display nicely on the screen. It's a little large. So we'll take it in portions at a time. Basically what this is an attribute AST that applies some attributes to a parameter inside of the entire param block. And you can see there's 4 different attributes it applies here. One of those being the mandatory attribute, which basically just tells that function that you can't call it unless you provide this parameter. And it turns out these true or false attributes, you can either just specify the name, mandatory, or you can say mandatory equals true. And that's functionally equivalent. So we can do something like that. The next one, the value for pipeline by property name, same thing. We can chop off that equals true, and it'll do the exact same thing. And then these are all these children nodes are just attributes. It doesn't really matter what order we apply the attributes in. So we can do something like this and just switch the position of all of them within the greater node. So now we're going to zoom out into the script a little bit, where the attribute AST is a child of another node. And we will first apply all that obfuscation we just did for that attribute AST, like that. And then we'll look at the second attribute AST, the alias one. These are just aliases for the parameter, so we can specify different names. And it turns out we can reorder all of those aliases like that. And then we'll zoom out one more time into the larger script. And you can see we were looking at that first parameter 1. So we'll first apply the obfuscation we found for that one. And it turns out we can do something very similar to the second parameter, just reorder all of those attributes. And now, you might have guessed it at this point, the parameters we specify can be specified in any order. So let's go ahead and switch those, and then zoom out one more time into the larger script. And you can see this is the larger script block AST that contains that param block we were just looking at. So we'll first apply the param block obfuscation we just found, like that. And now we'll look at the first named block, which is that begin block. And you can see we're just assigning a variable named start to some random value. It turns out when we assign variables, we don't need to use the variable equals expression. We can use something called set variable, which will do that for us. And in that get random call, we can specify the minimum and maximum in any order we want. Named parameters can be placed in any order. So we'll do both of those things, set variable, and then we'll switch minimum and maximum, and then move on to the next node, the process block, where we can do something very similar to the result variable. We'll use set variable. And then at the very end of that one, you can see there's a numeric expression, 1 plus 2. Turns out the addition operator in numeric expressions is commutative, so we can switch around the 1 and 2. So we have set variable, and we switched 1 plus 2 to 2 plus 1. And then the begin, process, and end block within this function can be placed in any order we want to. So we'll switch them around like that to finally come back with our fully obfuscated script. And you can start to see why I use obfuscation kind of in quotation marks. This isn't really obscuring what the function's doing really at all. It's just putting things in different order that are functionally equivalent. Comparing that to something like the PS token-based obfuscation we found, it doesn't really insert all those weird special characters and stuff. So when you go to try to use obfuscation detection on this, it's going to have a really hard time trying to detect that it's obfuscated. But if we have a bad signature, like the entire param block that we found earlier on the invoke mimikatz script, when we reorder things inside of that signature, it's going to break it and no longer be detected. And if you want to get really crazy, you can apply both of them, and you get something like that. So how is this done in PSAmsi? There's that get minimally obfuscated function we talked about earlier. So it'll run define AMSI signatures, get all of our signatures, iterate over every single one of them, and it'll try the AST-based obfuscation first and see if it defeated the signature. And if it did, and most of the time it does, it will use that obfuscation. And if that fails, it'll fall back to the PS token-based obfuscation and do that. So basically what we're doing is we're obfuscating only the known signatures, and we're only obfuscating as much as we need to. So let's see how this holds up against revoke obfuscation. First going to import the invoke and revoke obfuscation modules, and then we scan the mimikatz script again to verify it is detected. Now we're going to create a script block out of that thing and run it through invoke obfuscation to get a fully obfuscated script using PS token obfuscation. And then we will scan it, the obfuscated version, to see that it is no longer detected. We've defeated all the signatures. But when we run it through revoke obfuscation, obfuscation detection, it is detected as obfuscated. Whereas when we use PSAmsi's get minimally obfuscated function, it will also defeat all those signatures. But when we run it through revoke obfuscation, it is not detected as obfuscated. And the reason I use revoke obfuscation as an example here is it's really the best form of obfuscation detection out there for PowerShell. So this kind of just exemplifies the benefits of minimizing obfuscation. But it is worth noting that revoke obfuscation is actually built on a machine learning model, so it may actually train on some of this data and get better. So we probably have more than one PowerShell script that we want to run. We probably have a collection of malicious PowerShell scripts that we run all the time. And so PSAmsi can take input from the PowerShell pipeline to do multiple scripts at the same time. But it's not really convenient to download all of our malicious scripts to disk and then running the file paths through PSAmsi because our traditional file scanning AV will get in the way of that and mess things up. So with that in mind, I built in a client-server architecture to PSAmsi. You just start up the server with start PSAmsi server on like an attacker-controlled box. And this can actually be run on Linux or Mac or whatever. PowerShell's cross-platform now, which is neat. So all it does is it opens up a port on the server. Then you start up the client on like a Windows 10 machine with AMSI support. It'll connect back to the server and ask for all the scripts that you want to operate on. It'll send it back, do all the stuff we've been talking about, finding signatures and obfuscating, and then it'll send back the results to the server, and the output will actually come on the server side. So at this point, you might be thinking, all right, this is all neat and good, but it's generating a bunch of AV alerts. I can't use this. And yeah, you're right, it's kind of a bummer, but it's also kind of the entire point of the project, so there's not a lot I can do about it. So with that in mind, PSAmsi is best utilized in a test environment to quickly create payloads you know will not be detected by a particular anti-malware provider. With that being said, I can't think of a few instances where you could just like YOLO it and do it in production. For instance, like if we know the blue team is not collecting or monitoring their AV alerts, then we might not care about them. We'll just run it anyway. We just want things to execute. Or like it's a really long-term engagement, and the one-time noise is going to be worth the guaranteed stealth over the long term. So PSAmsi does offer a lot of ways to control and limit the alerts that you do generate. One thing you can do is specify an alert limit and say like, hey, don't generate more than 5 alerts. And it might not finish before it generates that many alerts, but you have really fine-grained control for what it's doing. And another thing you can do is actually spread alerts across hosts using this. So you have to be careful with this, because you have to decide whether it'd be better to create 1 alert on 10 hosts or 10 alerts on 1 host. And that's going to be very highly dependent on what environment you're in. The way you do that is you just start up multiple clients, but all with an alert limit. Same thing happens. The clients connect back. The server sends the scripts to the client. It tries to do all this requests that you've asked of it, but then it's going to run out of alerts. It's going to reach that alert limit you specified, and it's going to send back incomplete results to the server, and the server is going to inform the second client of the progress of the first client, and the second one will pick up where that one left off, scanning and obfuscating, and send back the complete results to the server, and again the output comes on the server side. So that's kind of all the demos and stuff I have for PSAmsi. And I really think this is only going to become more relevant over time. Defense is improving. So just a few weeks ago, Windows 10 version 1709 came out, which introduced some improvements to Windows Defender and included a bunch of attack surface reduction rules. And a lot of these are actually really cool. You should be sure to go check them out if you're a defender or attacker, because you need to be aware of them. And one of those caught my eye. One was a rule to block obfuscated scripts. And it actually uses the AMSI to not only look for signatures, but to look for obfuscated content. And so this was kind of something I was a little worried about might happen, and a big encouragement for me to actually write PSAmsi. And I tried to download it and run it. And again, I'm a noob. Maybe I set something up wrong. I couldn't get it to detect on anything. But it's just a sign that that's where things are moving on Microsoft's side. And pretty soon, as attackers, we're not going to be able to run our fully obfuscated scripts. And the AMSI itself is evolving. It's a relatively new technology. And several times during my research for PSAmsi, I would go back to Microsoft documentation and find things, new things that have been added or changed. And it'll become more relevant even beyond PowerShell. So like we said earlier, there's more than just PowerShell utilizing this thing. There's other languages like JScript and VBScript. So that's something I'd love to incorporate into PSAmsi eventually. We can already scan arbitrary strings, but we need to implement some sort of signature finding and obfuscation for those languages as well. And I thought that JScript would be my next language to kind of look at, but then I saw this tweet from John Lambert, who works at Microsoft, that AMSI is coming for Office applications on VBA macros. So pen testers and red teamers, we love to use these for phishing attacks for like initial entry. So this could be a big roadblock pretty soon. So with that being said, oh yeah, and there's an entirely second side to the AMSI, the anti-malware provider side. So PSAmsi lives on like the left side of this equation, right? But then there's this whole right side interface that there's still room for research. So with that being said, I'm very open to contributions on PSAmsi if anyone wants to help me out. And where do you find it? It's on GitHub, right there. And I just pushed version 1.1 out today that has all of the AST-based obfuscation, all the stuff I talked about. And I plan on posting like some blog posts kind of about some of the topics I talked about. I've kind of been lazy and haven't done that since DerbyCon, but it's coming. And I'll tweet out links to those as they come out. I kind of have some closing thoughts, both from a defensive perspective and an offensive perspective. From a defensive perspective, PSAmsi really highlights that the AMSI signatures need to catch up with obfuscation detection. The obfuscation detection is really pretty good, but we need more signatures that actually force us to use obfuscation. Secondly, as defenders, feel free to use PSAmsi to audit your AMSI signatures. See if you're catching what you expect to catch. You might be surprised. But really, as defenders, we need to shift to thinking about detection over prevention. AMSI is a great step in the right direction for prevention, and it sets up a great infrastructure for preventing known bad, but it's just not designed to prevent all bad. So we really need to think about detection. How do we do that? We collect, centralize, and monitor our command line logs, script block logs, all of our PowerShell logs, stuff we know about. And additionally, you can do things like obfuscation detection, using revoke obfuscation to look through your script block logs. From an offensive perspective, absolutely things are going to be moving towards other languages with less protections than PowerShell, such as JScript. Doesn't have quite the same logging capabilities as PowerShell, and like C# or .NET doesn't have the same logging capabilities and also doesn't take advantage of AMSI. But in the meantime, offensive PowerShell is not dead yet. Rarely you're going to run into the enhanced security features, and if you are, there's ways around them. Use your AMSI and script block logging bypasses. Use obfuscation, minimize your obfuscation, and hopefully PSAmsi can help you to do that. So I do want to take a second and acknowledge a few people, particular people whose code I used in PSAmsi. So a big shout out to Daniel Bohannon, who was the developer of Invoke Obfuscation, and to PSReflect, developed by Matt Graber, that helps us call the functions inside of the AMSI DLL. If you haven't checked out these projects, definitely be sure to do so. And also, I want to be sure to mention, I've talked about revoke obfuscation a couple times, and that is developed by Daniel Bohannon and Lee Holmes. So that's the end of my presentation. I think I have some time for questions if anyone has any. Shoot. That's a good question. So anyone that wasn't able to hear that, he asked if it's going to be integrated into PowerShell Empire. The answer is yes, it already is. So I did some work a while back to integrate invoke obfuscation into PowerShell Empire. So it actually already has all the PS token-based obfuscation integrated already. Whether like the AST-based obfuscation will be integrated is another question. I think I'd like to eventually answer that. Any other questions? Cool. Thanks, people.